Good afternoon, comrades and friends. I'm very pleased to be with you today, albeit remotely, for this exciting event that you're hosting in Surrey. And on behalf of the Canadian Peace Congress, I'd like to congratulate the Fraser Valley Peace Council and other sponsoring organizations for this important initiative. Over the past several weeks and months, we have all been painfully reminded once again of the common challenges that humanity faces on this spaceship, this rock that we call Earth. We're all witnessing the devastating impact of climate change, not as some potential threat in the distant future, but as a daily reality. Runaway global warming caused by our continued reliance on fossil fuels, combined with the devastation of rainforests and natural habitat, is literally igniting extreme weather patterns right around the world. Scorching heat waves and forest fires, torrential rains and floods across many parts of Europe and Asia. These are just some of the manifestations of the man-made environmental destruction wrought over the past several decades. We're also confronted by a public health crisis of monumental proportions connected with the global COVID-19 pandemic. Over the past year and a half, that crisis has already claimed the lives of over 4 million people, overwhelmed healthcare infrastructures in many countries, sparked a deep economic crisis, and further increased social disparities both within and between countries, increasing unemployment, impoverishment, and despair almost everywhere. If there was ever a time for the nations and the peoples of the world to come together as one, to strengthen our cooperation and common action to address these existential threats, that time is surely now. Unfortunately, we're witnessing the exact opposite. Growing antagonisms and hostilities, rising militarization and preparations for war, and the rejection of the principles of the UN Charter and international law in favor of unilateralism and the law of the jungle. The weaponization of trade and economic relations to extract concessions and to asphyxiate economies and peoples through sanctions and other coercive measures, ethnic cleansing, regime change and hybrid warfare, genocidal policies and actions, and a new Cold War against the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. How do we explain this massive disconnect, this counterintuitive response to the common challenges facing humanity, without also addressing in a clear and forthright manner the feverish attempts of the imperialist powers, led by U.S. imperialism and its closest allies, including Canada, to cling to its waning hegemony, its ability to dominate the entire world and to exploit and plunder the human and natural resources of the globe, regardless of the cost. That is why the Canadian Peace Congress proudly advances an anti-imperialist perspective in its struggle for peace, for nuclear, and for conventional disarmament. Ever since its founding in 1949, the Peace Congress and the World Peace Council, to which we are a member, have always held high the banner of anti-imperialism and solidarity with all peoples, fighting for liberation, sovereignty, and independence, and the right to choose their own destinies without foreign interference, pressure, or war. We did so even when we were a lone voice in the wilderness and vilified as agents of a foreign power during the Cold War years. And we're heartened that today more and more people are coming around to share this anti-imperialist perspective. But we are still too small, and the dangers very great. Where does racism figure in all of this? Well, the organizers of your event are quite correct to draw a direct link between the struggle against the ideology and institutionalization of racism on one hand, and the struggle against aggression and war on the other, because the two are inextricably linked, dialectically connected. So it was in the past, and so it remains the case today. Racism has always been an essential weapon in the arsenal of ruling circles to justify their acts of plunder and domination and their genocidal crimes against subjugated peoples in the colonies and their spheres of influence. From the indigenous peoples of this hemisphere to Africa, the Middle East, South and East Asia, and Australia. Whether promulgated to rationalize the colonial domination of Africa and the enslavement of blacks in the New World, the wars and occupations against the Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, and other East Asian peoples, the Holocaust of the Jews in Europe, the genocide of indigenous peoples on this continent and in this country we call Canada, or against the people of the Indian subcontinent and the British colonial rule or elsewhere. The objective of this racism has always been to dehumanize its victims, to negate their right to independent development, and to justify the civilizing role of Western colonial and later imperialist domination, the so-called white man's burden. And it was also used to sow divisions amongst the peoples, both in the subjugated regions and within the working classes in their home countries as well. These historical examples are important because they give a context to the continuing organized use of racism today to justify the displacement of the Palestinian peoples, for instance, by the Zionist state of Israel, the mass imprisonment and torture of their leaders and activists, the annexation and theft of their lands, and the wanton murder of their people in Gaza and the West Bank. We see it in India under the Modi government and under the rule of Hindu nationalism and extremism against the Muslim and other non-Hindu peoples, and against the Chinese people, disguised as an attack on the Chinese Communist Party, and of course the continuing oppression of indigenous nations and peoples in this part of Turtle Island. The rise of attacks and killings of blacks, indigenous peoples, Asians, and other peoples of color in Canada and the US is a direct result of the racist, white supremacist ideology and mentality, which has unfortunately sunk deep roots in our societies, but which always was and continues to be in the service of the ruling capitalist class. That is why we say, to fight aggression, militarism, and war, we must fight against imperialist domination. And to unite our ranks, our forces against imperialism, we must also fight against racism and white supremacy. They are all part and parcel of one common struggle, and we do so in turn in a desperate attempt to save our planet from environmental and/or nuclear destruction. Those conclude my remarks for today. I want to wish you a most successful event. I wish I was there. Hands off Cuba. Justice for the Palestinian people. Venceremos. Thank you.